Welcome to Horst Eisfelder, Diasporic Life in Shanghai's State of Exception, in our series Flight or Fight, Stories of Artists Under Repression. After fleeing Berlin a few weeks before the so-called Night of Broken Glass and arriving in Shanghai with his family in late November 1938, Horst Eisfelder became one of the most prolific photographers of the Shanghai Ghetto before emigrating to Australia in May 1947. He passed on earlier this year. With this event, we commemorate the 85th anniversary of the November pogroms in Nazi Germany, during which synagogues and Jewish shops were destroyed and looted, and around 30,000 Jewish men arrested and sent to concentration camps. It was a pivotal moment on the path to mass murder. I'm Rachel Stern, Director and CEO of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. We research, discuss, publish, and exhibit artists whose life and work were affected by the German Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945. With this work, we commemorate their lives and achievements. Today, I'm honored to welcome three speakers. Dr. Noit Banai is an art historian and critic who specializes in modern and contemporary art and in a global context, with a focus on conditions of migrations, exile, diaspora, border regimes, and statelessness. Before joining Hong Kong Baptist University as Associate Professor of Art and Theory, she was Professor of Contemporary Art in the Department of Art History at the University of Vienna, and lecturer of Modern and Contemporary Art at Tufts University School of the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. She's the author of Eve Klein, Reaction Books 2014, Being a Border, Paper Visual Arts 2021, and articles appearing in journals such as Third Text, Stateless Studies, Public Culture, Performing Arts Journal, and Texte zur Kunst. She served as an assistant editor for the journal RES, Anthropology and Aesthetics, and is a regular contributor to Art Forum International. Her current project, Stateless Jewish Artists Refugees, Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Singapore, 1933 to 1950, develops a transnational analysis of the artistic production of stateless European Jewish artists who were living under the logic of modernity, coloniality, and the Japanese occupation in three East Asian cities. Our second speaker is Dr. Anna Hirsh, who's the manager of collections and research at the Melbourne Holocaust Museum, where she has worked for nearly a decade. She holds a PhD in Jewish History and Culture, a Masters of Art Curatorship, and a Bachelor of Education in Visual Arts. She is responsible for the collection, documentation, and preservation of the collection at the MHM, which holds artifacts and testimonies mostly from the Melbourne survivor and descendant community. She provides research and content support across the museum and externally. Anna has worked on various museum and art projects over the years. She holds the honorary positions of co-president of the Australian Association for Jewish Studies and honorary fellow at Deakin University. Welcome, Anna. And I welcome Rodney Eisfelder, who is Horst Eisfelder's son. He will join us for the discussion after the first two talks. After the talks, we will have time for Q&A, so please post your questions in the chat function. So now welcome to the three of you, and Noit, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Let me share my screen and put it on beginning. And let me also take a moment to thank you, my warmest thank yous and gratitude to Rodney and Susie Eisfelder, first and foremost. along with their daughters, who welcomed me into their home in June in Melbourne, shortly after the passing of Horst Eisfelder. So my gratitude is really first and foremost to them. Otherwise, we would not have a talk today. And it was very meaningful for me to meet them and to share moments with them, speaking about Rodney's father. I'd been trying to meet Horst for almost 2 years. After seeing some of his photographs at the Shanghai Jewish Refugee Museum in 2020. I started corresponding with him after I moved to Hong Kong in August 2021. But unfortunately, because of the pandemic regulations in Australia and Hong Kong, it was impossible for me to meet him in person. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Anna Hirsh, to whom I'm very, very grateful for joining us today. I had the pleasure of meeting her also in Melbourne this summer, and she welcomed me at the Melbourne Holocaust Museum while it was still under renovation, and showed me parts of their collection. And it was important to see the context and the framework where Horst Eisfelder also will be researched in the future. And Rachel Stern, thank you very much for this invitation to speak on the platform of the Fritz Asher Society. And also, finally, I'd like to thank Patrick Cranley and Tina Kanagaratnam of Historic Shanghai, on whose many walks in Shanghai, I learned to see the many layers of the city that still coexist. And without them, also, I would not have been able to contextualize this project. So thank you. Thank you to everyone also for joining us around the world. Now I'm going to start the talk. And as Rachel mentioned, after fleeing Berlin a few weeks before Kristallnacht and arriving in Shanghai with his family in late November 1938, Horst Eisfelder became one of the most prolific photographers of the so-called Shanghai Ghetto before emigrating to Australia in May 1947. As this quote suggests, once having started taking photos, I kept on taking photos because they support your memory. So as this quote suggests, Eisfelder took photographs as a way to support his memory of the period in Shanghai, not knowing how long he will be there, not knowing how long the period of the war will be and where he will end up afterwards. So it was an important memory project for him as a young man in Shanghai. Yet, as is also the case, and this is where my art historical framing comes in, photographs also create and form memories, both personal and collective, not only document them or record them, but also actively shape them. And looking at his oeuvre from the present, Eisfelder's images are both historical records and artistic representations that are part of a Western modernist language of photography. They capture everyday life in Shanghai and the so-called ghetto, but they also artistically shape those scenes by a photographic language with a particular history and with specific conventions. So in this next slide, I wanted to show you the fundamental convention of the photographer at work, right? It's a kind of comparative moment. Photographers very often represent themselves, right? But in these two instances, on the left, Robert Capa, and on the right, Man Ray, you see the photographic apparatus as a way to document history with Robert Capa, and on the right with Man Ray as a way to artistically shape, artistically translate reality into an image. So Horst Eisfelder is somewhere between these two poles of documentary photographer and artistic vision, artistic translator. And it's important to already posit that as we start thinking about the images that will follow. Including this family photo from 1936, the golden wedding anniversary of his grandparents on his mother's side. And here you see them assembled around the table in Lübeck, Germany. And here too, we have precedents, right? Precedents of this convention of a family photograph, of an interior scene, of portraiture as well, which I will show you here, for example, with August Sander from the same period, more or less, around the same period, the interwar period, the Weimar period, and following. So August Sander with a middle-class family in Cologne on the left and pastry chef on the right. So the photographs, once again, belong to a specific history, to a specific genealogy, to a specific modernist language of showing the subject, of representing the human figure. And so just to go back here for a second, my argument, I have a few points that I would like to make while showing the images. One is that we need to make his unique story better and more widely known, but we also need to embed the history of this moment in Shanghai, as well as the designated area for stateless refugees, within the history and theory of photography. And this is a way to insert Horst Eisfelder into the field of art history and recognize his contributions to the field, which is necessary. It's also...
Just
yes?
Very briefly, Noit, I don't want to interrupt you. Could you start the slideshow? Because we still have, you're not full.
Excuse me, on my end, I see the slideshow. I apologize that you cannot see the slideshow. On my end, it was running. Let me start again then. So this is the photo. Did you see this?
From current slide, you should, because we still have the perfect. Thank you.
Okay, I will not start the whole lecture again, but this is the first slide, obviously, with Horst Eisfelder in his photograph. This was the comparative slide with Robert Capa on the left and Man Ray on the right to show self-portraiture or portraiture with of the photographer. This is the family photo that I mentioned is also part of the history of domestic interiors and portraiture. This is August Sander, who was active in forming the very genre, the very language of portraiture photography at that moment. Okay, and I apologize that you did not see anything before that. So here we are. And back to my point, I was going to say that one is the continuation of modernist conventions. And what's important here is that it was a way for Eisfelder, in my argument, to transform the unfamiliar conditions of statelessness into an experience that could be integrated within certain Western norms of seeing, of shaping knowledge, of creating subjects. And this means that photography is an apparatus that we need to think about, that creates subjects, produces subjects, right? Photography is part of an entire kind of network of apparatuses that capture the individual, that shape the individual, that play a role in forming a subject and forming a historical moment. So it's very important for me that this particular apparatus is contextualized in the very specific conditions of living in Shanghai as a stateless subject, and under conditions of modernity, hyper-modernity, Shanghai being this incredible modern city, and also coloniality with different concessions, with different people coming from around the world to try their luck in Shanghai, but also different refugees speaking different languages, coming from different class, gender, language backgrounds, etc. So this is what I would like to propose. So to start the narrative, also the historical narrative, we have the flight. It's important that we show this moment of flight on the Conte Verde, the boat that took Horst Eisfelder and his family from Trieste onwards to Shanghai. And I will not show comparative images, but there are many, many images that we see of this moment, of the flight, of seeking exile by, with the ship as an important vessel, not only to Shanghai, but also refugees coming to New York at a different moment, or immigrants. So this is an important moment also in our story. And just to bring you into the map of Shanghai, what you see in this map of 1937 is the international settlement in purple, which was quite large, quite broad in 1937. But it was only in 1941 that after Pearl Harbor, actually, that the Japanese occupied, let's say, the international settlement, and only in 1943 that it was turned into this designated area for stateless refugees. But this is the map, and this is the area that we are speaking about. So within that, we see Eisfelder's first family apartment in Shanghai on the left, that was arranged by the International Committee when they stepped off, the family stepped off the boat. And on the right, so that would be in the international settlement. And then on the right, we see his photograph from I guess around 1941 of the Cafe Hotel, now the Peace Hotel. And I also left his captions, because I think it's important to see how meticulous, absolutely meticulous he was in memorizing, in creating this memory through his captions and through his notations, which are very, very important, of course, for a historian. But we see this hyper-modern city, right, with the Cafe Hotel that was built by Victor Sassoon, and in front we see street vendors. So this juxtaposition also of modernity and poverty, and on the left, the new home, the new space that they would occupy until the family opened up their cafe. And what's also important to show you is, of course, that the kind of images that he not only took, but that he had taken of him, right? So his own framing of himself within this landscape as a young man. I don't want to say as a tourist, but this kind of exploration or curiosity for this new city and its particular surroundings, so different from Berlin, right? So different from Berlin, circa 1942. You can almost, not know, I mean, obviously not, I don't want to say that he didn't know there was a war, but when you look at this image, it's a kind of tantalizing image of a young man abroad as well, wandering around the city at this point quite freely with his brother, most probably. Also, very much attracted by the modernity of the city, right? The Majestic Theater, which was built in 1941 by one of the most important architects of modernity in Shanghai. It became one of the last cinemas of old Shanghai and appears in various photographs. But I think it's important that we see his gaze, or the way that his photographs mark the modernity of Shanghai. As a stateless person coming from Berlin, also hypermodern, we see a kind of recognition of an equally modern city, an equally cosmopolitan city that he's in. Likewise, for this image of the Great World Amusement Center, one of the most important spaces for entertainment in this period. And you can see here, of course, a kind of curiosity and attraction for this, for all of these posters, for all of these messages, for this kind of modern barrage of media communication, right? Calling forth the public to come into the Great World Amusement Center, to enjoy themselves, to be modern, right? To, even as we are already in 1941. Likewise, there's a attention to the kind of eccentricities, let's say, during wartime, right? The inventions that came out of this moment of extreme urgency, out of extreme contingency, the inventive spirit of Shanghai and of the people in it. And once again, I'm taking you to this kind of modern gaze of Horst Eisfelder. And as he's wandering around the city, he is using certain conventions, once again, of the avant-garde. Whether he knows it or not, whether this is a conscious decision or whether he's actually imbibed and permeated with the language of his day, that's a different point, right? He obviously, he had access to the movies. He was going to the movies. There was a lot of advertisement around Shanghai that was kind of equally in touch with or creating a kind of avant-garde perspective. But I think these two images are really important to show us that he's of his moment in terms of this kind of slight upward gaze, this angle that somehow estranges us somewhat from the scene. And this is firmly embedded in the history of both the Bauhaus and the Russian avant-garde. So again, this is not about whether he knew this or not intentionally, but this is a kind of modernist language that is circulating also in Shanghai, circulating through the different people who are there, through the kind of media images that are being created, through the advertisements that are circulating. And he is very much participating in that and shaping Shanghai, shaping our gaze of Shanghai through that kind of gaze. He's also attentive to the less, let's say, attractive or attractive parts of war, right? And living in a city that is under occupation. Japanese occupation, and the kind of everyday scenes that become the norm in this state of exception. Seeing bodies on the street while others are basically being pulled around on rickshaws. This kind of invisibility somehow of certain bodies, Chinese bodies, right, that also now become part of the fate of the city, not only Jewish refugees, but also Chinese local population that's already there, and many who are moving or escaping from Nanjing to come to Shanghai. And it's this kind of melting pot of different refugees and different dispossessed people who are navigating the city together. So now to continue this narrative, his family opened the Café Louis. It was the space was leased in 1938, so pretty much December 1938. Pretty much as quickly as they arrived, they were set up, thankfully, and it opened in February 11th, 1939, on Bubbling Well Road, which is now West Nanjing Road, a very important street in Shanghai. This family lived on the top floor above the shop and the bakehouse, and here you see his brother Erwin with the staff, who are a multicultural staff, and this thriving business, which continued until February 1943 in this spot, helped the family survive. You also see his father on the far right. So it's important to see the kind of continuation of life, right, and continuation of a certain kind of open-minded spirit of working with the local population, working together, surviving together to make this business work. This is the view from opposite the cafe, also on Bubbling Well Road, just to show you this time a downward gaze rather than an upward gaze, a kind of panoramic bird's eye perspective of the city or of the street that was, kind of significant in his life at that point, a view that he would have probably seen, many, many times. And now this everyday scene, much like Ujenaje, which I did not bring a comparison, but the French photographer Adjé, who also was very keen to memorialize and to document streets in Paris that would later disappear. So there's a kind of recognition of potential disappearance or future disappearance of these everyday scenes that should be memorialized, even as they are just fleeting everyday moments. Now, in 1943, as I mentioned, the proclamation came from the Imperial Japanese Army to establish the designated area for stateless refugees, and all Jews who came, all Jews who came after 1937 had to move into this area by May of 1943. This was a ghetto unlike the European ghettos. It did not have a wall. It did not have a fence, but it had, but you needed a pass to leave it. So it's a different kind of setup of internment, in which his family had to reestablish themselves. They had to move from their first dwelling to a second dwelling. And here is the map of the so-called ghetto, which was 1 square mile, home to around 25,000 Jews and 100,000 Shanghai locals in very, very dense, very dense situation. Here is his residency certificate for this area of stateless refugees. And I'm bringing this also as an example of photography's complicity or photography's use in documenting, the subject, documenting the human being for administrative purposes, which was important not only, of course, in Shanghai. Here you see the yellow mark on the top, which of course, designates that Horst Eisfelder was Jewish. But this kind of language of photography is still with us today, right? The administrative language of the photographic apparatus. And Eisfelder writes in his book about the process of actually leaving, when you wanted to leave the ghetto or you wanted to leave this designated area for stateless refugees, you would have to meet the very notoriously unpredictable and unpleasant man named Goya, who was generally referred to and also called himself the King of the Jews. And there are many stories and many accounts of the process of waiting for this pass and the kind of humiliation that Goya took great joy in inflicting on men, women, and children in order to receive this pass. Luckily, Eisfelder, and actually he was the only one from his family at that point who could leave this area because he had a job outside of this perimeter. And so he was able to regularly leave the designated area for stateless refugees. And that is why also we have so many photographs during this period from outside of this space. But here you see the second Café Louis, or you see the sign kind of in the distance in the second floor for the second Café Louis, which was now inside the perimeter. They reformed it under different circumstances. You see here his mother and his brother outside of the facade of the Café Louis, right? Continuing this business, but also if you think about moving to Melbourne afterwards, where there was a great cake culture brought in by Jewish refugees, they're already forming a diaspora in kind of cultivating not only a business, but a culture that they brought with them from Berlin, a cake culture. They're already also creating the conditions for diasporic Jewry in Melbourne, where on Acklin Street and other streets around St. Kilda, you have this great kind of density of cafes started by Jewish immigrants later on. Now, I also want to show you in the time that I have left the view of everyday life, right? Everyday life in at the Broadway Theater. This is probably in afternoon, and from the light suggests that they're having coffee and cake in the afternoon, or enjoying a moment, kind of respite from their reality up on Roy's roof garden. In the background, though, you see the jail, the Ward Road jail, that's ever present in this existence, right? On the one hand, cafe culture. On the other hand, they're in a space that is basically a space of internment. And there is a jail in the background, the Ward Road jail, that's still there today. You also see other cafes that are active in this area. The specialty here was ice water and iced coffee, written in German, Eiscafé on the window. These are fascinating photos, the ones that are kind of this mad rush of people that are slightly, foggy and out of focus, as a way to capture the masses, the foule in French, the public, this kind of, being part of the multitude of people in this space, trying to memorialize or to memorize or to create a post-memory for future generation of this intense experience of navigating this density. Likewise, you see this photo, and in all of them, you see basically a subject, facing forward. This is a kind of convention of portraiture in a crowd, right? And the crowd is just as important. And if we start to actually historicize what we're seeing, which we don't have the time to do today, this is more than a snapshot of a woman in the market, right? This is more than a snapshot of a man in the crowd. This is an entire kind of historical, we can historically contextualize all the forces and networks of power and of administration that brought them to that moment, to that situation, in this kind of in this public photo. I'm just passing through this so you can see it. You can see also the ruins, right? He is very conscious and aware of this, contradiction also of modernity in one part of the city, ruin in another part of the city. Of course, the rest of Shanghai was also at times hit by Allied bombings. Or Japanese military occupation, but it's very important that he captures both the ruins and the modern, both the kind of dispossession and the life, right? The life within it, the modern life within it. Here is the building in the center, which is their second family house. And I want to end very soon to allow Dr. Hirsh to also intervene and interject. So I'll just show you this kind of, once again, this contradiction, right, of continuing life, of maintaining life in shops, in a kind of modern environment, also creating already a diasporic reality that will come later in terms of certain cultural norms that the Berliner Jews brought with them, but also street culture, the reality of that wartime situation. So I'll just show you the last few photos. This is 1945, after the liberation of the so-called ghetto, sitting in the public garden, once again, with these signs of modernity behind them. The Cathay Hotel. Between 45 and 46, Eisfelder participated or worked for the US forces in the Signal Corps. This is a whole other episode that would require a different lecture. And here is a photo of leaving Shanghai, 1947. Once again, this kind of indistinct, slightly out of focus or ambiguous image of the crowd, right? Which is also a modern convention of people in the city, urban life, anonymity on the one hand, but also if we start thinking about the individual experience, what that means to carry that experience for each one of these individuals into the future, into their diasporic life, whether in Australia or elsewhere. So thank you very much. I'd like to now close up this part of my presentation and invite Dr. Hirsh to share her screen. I will stop my sharing here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noit, and thank you for the introduction. What an incredible presentation. I feel very privileged to be able to be invited and talk a little bit about application of Noit's research and how that extends on what we do at our museum. Firstly, thank you to Rodney and Susie Eisfelder, to Professor Noit Banai, Rachel Stern and the Fritz Asher Society's invitation to join you to speak a little bit on Horst Eisfelder's contributions to the Melbourne Holocaust Museum. It was absolutely wonderful to meet Noit a few months ago and to show her our work at the museum and how we can discuss collaborative projects that extends on what we do and supports what Noit is achieving. So I will be extending on Noit's presentation and endeavour to apply some analysis on the meaning of Horst Eisfelder's photographs, along with other Shanghai-related personal items in the museum collections, and the significance of such images and objects when they're brought into the public realm of museum archives and exhibitions. This also charts the prelude to Jewish contributions to Melbourne. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge that Melbourne Holocaust Museum, from where I'm speaking to you, stands on the traditional lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future. And I'd also like to memorialise our murdered people of October the 7th and say never again is now. So as Noit mentioned, our museum is located in the Australian state of Victoria. We are just about to relaunch the newly developed museum and exhibitions to the public after a major redevelopment project. And what makes our museum unique in the world is that our stories and our collections converge for the most part to the diasporic point of destination in Australia and more particularly to Melbourne. So this destination was just one city chosen for Jewish people fleeing Nazi persecution. So let's now peer down the other end of the lens of photographer Horst Eisfelder and his connection with our museum, and particularly a long-standing relationship with our director and former curator, Jane Josem, who has used his photography in exhibitions over the years. And this work has been captured on our website through our virtual museum portal, and which is available online at the URL that you can see below this image, and through our website, which is mhm.org.au. And this capture has become a virtual archive as our building has since been mostly pulled down apart from a facade and blended into our new building. So this multimedia display presented a sequence of photographs by Eisfelder in a section that led to an alcove, which you can see behind that display case in the corner, which featured the theme of hiding. And one of our board members, Simon Schwartz, captured the entire museum layout. And this has, in fact, landed on the image of a city gate in Nanking from 1946, which was towards the end of the Eisfelder family's experience in their temporary zone. So Eisfelder's work is also displayed in our new permanent museum, and this has been presented as a collage, which I will be speaking further on. Our curatorial team, Jane Josem, Sandy Saxon, Gavin O'Connor and Arik DeBell, spent time with Eisfelder over the years and discuss the possibilities of this new display for exhibition. And currently I'm in discussion with his son, Rodney Eisfelder, regarding bringing items, including photos, albums and documents, and discussing whether they can be brought into the museum collection, which will be a fantastic contribution, reflective not only of a personal story, but expands narrative possibilities through the interconnection with other collections from people who spent time in Shanghai and then migrated to Melbourne. The items that move from the private home and enter the public realm become universalized, and a key objective of my work here is to endorse this. And a little bit of history for context. For the Australian story, Melbourne and Sydney doubled their Jewish populations in the post-war era, with the two major Australian cities each swelling to over 36,000 Jewish people. And when we consider the places of origin Of these migrations, Sydney saw a high influx of Czech and Hungarian refugees. Melbourne had a predominantly Polish Jewish population, and both states saw migrations of German and Austrian Jews both before and after the Holocaust. And there were migrations to other Australian cities, but these were on a much smaller scale. In Melbourne and in Hong Kong, it's already the 9th of November, which is the anniversary of Kristallnacht, the pogrom perpetuated by the SA, the Hitler Jugend, and their supporters against the Jews, deaths, injuries, arrests, and incarcerations, as well as widespread destruction of Jewish homes, businesses, religious and secular institutions, a physically destructive culmination of the anti-Jewish laws that the Nazis had been inflicting since coming to power. For German and Austrian Jews who had been reluctant or indecisive as whether to leave, it was a major turning point. But even before Kristallnacht, it wasn't such a straightforward path to be able or allowed to immigrate. Nazi-imposed conditions aside, most countries across the world restricted visas to Jews and imposed high permit fees or inaccessible criteria for many. Australia endorsed a White Australia policy by the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901 at the Evian Conference of June 1938, which addressed Jews in crisis and migration. Australia still did not increase its quota for Jews. However, after Kristallnacht, the quota was increased to 15,000 permits for Jews over 3 years. But ultimately, only around 7,000 of these permits were fulfilled during the war period. Post-war policy increased emphasis on family reunification, but also imposed strict limits on Jewish refugees at 25% per incoming vessel, which was often very difficult to fulfill. Going back, the Eisfelder family, Leopold Ludwig or Louis and his wife Hedwig, their sons Erwin and Horst, narrowly eluded the violence of Kristallnacht, having already left Berlin for Shanghai in October. Louis' older brother in the United States pledged an amount of $1,000, which is around equivalent of $22,000 today, but would not support their entry to the US for personal reasons. After applying for entry to Argentina and Costa Rica, the family managed to get a permit to Australia, and the HIAS, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, assisted their application. The cost of entry permits to Australia varied from 200 to 1,000 English pounds, and a suitable vocation was also needed, often with a pledged job by sponsors, so that immigrants would not negatively impact the economy or job market or create any social upheaval. Post-war, the unification schemes would be endorsed, but in 1938, Melbourne was still many years ahead for the Eisfelder family. So Shanghai's long history as an international city central to trade had attracted many Jews from various regions and for many reasons, including fleeing persecution. In the interbellum era, as Noit has shown through these beautiful images, Shanghai grew substantially and contributed to its reputation as a modern hub. As a visa was not needed, it made a suitable transit destination for stateless Jews, for those unable to obtain papers in time for their desired destinations. And for Horst Eisfelder, the 9 years spent in this international and fascinating city as a young teen and then young adult were profoundly impactful to the rest of his life. In the narrative of the Melbourne Holocaust Museum's exhibition space, the section on evading the Nazis features hiding places, false identification, and temporary zones, including Soviet Union and Shanghai. Jews were never completely free in these zones during the war, although they were not officially targeted for extermination. So Shanghai morphed from a safe harbour to a fraught zone after Japan entered World War II in 1941 and attacked and occupied the city on December the 8th. In 1943, pressured by its German alliance, the Japanese occupiers relegated Shanghai's Jewish inhabitants to a ghetto, namely a defined area of the city, which was within the older Hongqiu district. And while Jews were not compelled to wear identifiers, such as the yellow star, a yellow band was added as an identifier to their identity cards, as we saw earlier, and there were restrictions of movement, as we can see in this token, which is going on display. And Eisfelder described how he and his friends needed permission to attend Jewish youth groups, which lay outside the ghetto lines. As the war progressed, as residents, locals and emigres were subjected to threat and actuality of bombings, economic hardships, lack of food and resources, and the Eisfelders were forced to sell their cafe and re-establish their business within the ghetto. And later, towards the end of the war with Japan, a US bombing raid in July of 1945 caused the deaths of hundreds, including around 40 Jews. And I'll just give you a glimpse of a past exhibition at our museum. This was in 2015, so nearly 10 years ago, and some of the former inhabitants of the ghetto were invited to pin their residences within the ghetto. You can see the ghetto lines have been delineated, as well as the pre-ghetto residences, and this was such an interesting mapping concept because it showed a convergence of where people had to move from, as well as how close in proximity they were to each other, and particularly those who ended up migrating to Melbourne. So Eisfelder's prolific photography of Shanghai during this intense and eventful period allows us an opportunity to view Shanghai in both microcosm and macrocosm through his personalised, youthful perspective and as universal contributions to the documentation of Holocaust history. And the broad range of subjects and scenes that Eisfelder photographed captured the urban landscape and its myriad interesting inhabitants through a dynamic sequence of moments. And these significant moments in his own life also showed this emerging passion for photography, which was professionalised, of his family, of the successful Louis Cafe in both iterations, his romance, his jobs, his surroundings, the effects of war and destruction, and then his farewell to the city. The fleeting shutter flutter, applied thousands of times, immediately transformed Eisfelder's vision into historic testimony. And overall, this collection contributes to a visual compilation of the Shanghai experience, the Jewish refugees, providing tangible proof. Taking this further into the realm of international documentation, Eisfelder's work transcends the individuality of its creator. The street scenes become interlinked with testimonies and memoirs, illustrating scenes from memories, and not just limited to Eisfelder himself. So just to show you how the Shanghai stories can be interpreted through the museum display, we can see how items can be taken from different personal experiences and reconfigured in displays. So objects in museum collections transform into jigsaw puzzle pieces, and this display, which is in a soon-to-be-launched museum, is an example of how our curators, particularly Sandy Saxon, Jake Joseph and team, have assembled a display case titled The Life That Was, representing diversity of pre-war Jewish life. And the display contains a myriad items from Jewish people and communities, connecting religion, culture, cities and towns, gender and activities, both professional and leisure. We can see Judaica and domestic and personal objects from Germany, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and elsewhere. And this central item is a pestle from a mortar and pestle that belonged to another refugee family from Berlin, who also came to Shanghai, the Pulvermachers. And this pestle was used as a cooking implement in their Berlin deli. This was taken with them on their exodus, and it displays and demonstrates a chronology of events as well as a practicality where it was brought with a view to redeployment in professional use in new locations. And it was again put to use when the family eventually migrated to Melbourne. And another item is the photo album that they brought with them, which I will need to discuss with Rodney to identify whether his father's photos are amongst this compilation. So it just shows these overlaps, which I'm sure appear in albums such as these across the world, both at home and in museums. So other collections in our museums, as well as internationally, represent the experiences of Shanghai refugees who came from these different places and ended up in various destinations, but intersect. And digitisation is so wonderful because it allows access, examination, and both theoretical and physical reunions. So like the display case of the world that was, Eisfelder captured a broad range of Jewishness with his empathetic eyes, from the religious Jews who fled Poland, the Jewish institutions set up to assist, home and feed the needy, incoming souls, and Jews who originated from different cities and towns, just going about their everyday lives. And this is a sneak preview for all of you. I hope you make it to our beautiful city and see our incredible new museum. This is a location of where people fled, and it shows the compilation of Horst Eisfelder's incredible photographs on display with a little bit of a sneak peek close-up. So from a museum perspective, and specifically from the Holocaust Museum located in a migration destination way far from its origin of various loci, examining a collection is never limited to the item's physicality, but is spiritually bound to the people and stories that these items are connected to. And this extends to descendants who are very much connected to their parents' and grandparents' stories and carry on the duty of memorialisation. So of all the personal objects that people surround themselves with and often perceive as ephemera can sometimes be recontextualised and transformed into glittering fragments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna and Noit. This was really fascinating, and we now are going a little bit over time because we have with us Rodney Eisfelder, Horst Eisfelder's son. And Rodney, could you please unmute yourself? And yes, hello, hi.
Hi.
Welcome. I'm really excited that we get to ask you a few questions too. Please, everybody, put your questions in the chat function, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. But I want to start with a question for you, Rodney. When did your father and where did your father get his camera? Like, how did he start, photographing Shanghai?
The very first photos he took at the end of 1938 were using his brother's camera. Mm-hmm. So it was a borrowed camera. Mm-hmm. He eventually got cameras of his own, but I'd have to refer to some of his written work to give you an exact answer on that.
Mm-hmm. And actually, your whole family came from Berlin, but I'm wondering where the previous generations of your family came from.
all over the German Empire, I think, is the simplest answer. From Königsberg in the Far East to the Rhineland, and on my mother's side also from the northeastern part of France, Alsace and Lorraine. The Eisfelder ancestors themselves, my great-grandfather was born in Bamberg, and his father was born in a little place called Berg Prepach, which is northwest of Bamberg. So we're talking about the northwest part of Bavaria.
Mm-hmm. So they were long-standing residents of the German-speaking countries, right?
Yeah, but even on my father's side, roughly half are from what's now Poland.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about Posen and Danzig.
Mm-hmm. So how much? So you must have been raised very much with German customs and with how much was the Shanghai story of your family part of your upbringing? Was that all in the background once the family came to Australia, or how actively was that part of their history lived?
I'd say it was in the background, but it was always there. My father first wrote the earliest version of what would become his book. He wrote the first version about 1972, so that's 50 years ago. I was a lot younger then, and I'm pretty sure I read it. I read some of the earliest versions.
Mm-hmm. And what language, Ellen once is asking, what language did you speak at home? Did you learn to communicate in Chinese?
Oh, well, I certainly didn't know. English was my first language. My parents spoke German to each other when they didn't want their children to understand. I did learn German at high school, but not very well. And it's only in more recent years, as I've worked more and more on the genealogy, that I've had to refresh my German knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
My father, only spoke a little Chinese. I think he could read it a bit better than he could speak it, because you got a choice of dialects, and I think what spoken Chinese he had was mostly the Shanghai dialect.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly that was never used at home.
Mm-hmm.
It was only used when we occasionally went to a Chinese restaurant, when he would write down the order in Chinese to show off.
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't know how much of the selection of how many of his pictures I saw with this. I'm sure we only saw the tip of the iceberg today, but I was wondering, like, once there was this ghetto after 1943, designated area for stateless refugees, the whole area was very, very crowded, as Noit, you mentioned, with 100,000 locals and 20,000 Jews, and poverty was rampant, and so I did not see that in these images. Was that the selection of the images, or I mean, we saw that one picture with a dead Chinese on the street, or and I'm wondering, was that the perspective of your father, who was rather young during the whole time in Shanghai, or was that the selection of images that we saw?
The poorest of the Jewish refugees were living in the Heimat, which are established by the Jewish aid organizations. My father never photographed in there because he had no permissions to go there. He has some photographs from the Heimat, but that they were not taken by him. They were focusing more on the photos that he took. And that the photo of the corpse was not taken from the ghetto. That was taken, I think the inscription said it was on the border between the French settlement and the international area, which was a long way west of the ghetto.
Yeah. And I think it's important to mention also that, you know, it really depended when you came to Shanghai. Your parents, your family came, not your parents, your family came very early to Shanghai. The later you came, the less you could take with you, right? The last refugees who came to Shanghai, they just came with the clothes on their bodies, basically. So they didn't have, and by then the so-called ghetto was so crowded that it was hard to find any income really for the people who came that late, right?
Well, I think it did depend what resources you brought, what skills you had, and because my grandparents arrived there early, they had a bit more individual attention than those who arrived a little later, and that helped a little. But I think the $1,000 provided by my great uncle, I think, made a huge difference in enabling them to kickstart their enterprise. Yeah.
So now did your family ever return to China once they relocated to Australia?
Well, my grandparents never did. My father went back, I think, at least twice. At least once with my mother, at least once with a German film crew. I'm not sure whether I've accounted for all his trips back to China, but there were at least two.
How about Germany? Did they ever?
Again, at least 2 or 3 trips back to Germany. But the earliest of them was, I think, the mid-70s. So my grandparents never left Australia. They got here.
So so I understand that your the cafe that your grandparents, or your together, I guess, with your uncle and aunt, right, were
just uncle.
Yeah, or just uncle, was kind of a communal gathering point where people from the community came together to check up on each other and I guess also exchanged experiences and tips, right? Survival tips. Is that a Noit? Is that a behavior that you find normal in diaspora communities, that, you know, somebody steps up and creates a community gathering place?
Yes. Yes, that is the necessity for diasporic communities and refugees, and it still happens today, right? You have gathering spots for information. Today, it's obviously also online. But yes, you know, we have countless stories of you know, trading tips and information and getting jobs. You know, actually Horst Eisfelder got his first job because a customer from the cafe, you know, his mother asked, can you employ my 14-year-old son who didn't want to go to school anymore because the education there was slipshod. So yes, it was active then as a kind of network space, and also today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Rodney, somebody is asking whether your family, once they came to Australia, whether they continued to have cafes or whether that was over.
Well, they established a cake shop in Paran or Windsor, and they ran that from 1947 until they retired in the early 1960s. I was very young. I only have very vague memories of it. I think I remember having lunch there at least once, but that was sort of behind the curtain. So it wasn't a cafe. It was just a retail cake shop.
Okay. Did the menu, Nina is asking, did the menu include items from German and Chinese cuisine, or just German delicacies?
In Shanghai or in Melbourne? Because in Melbourne it wasn't. I don't. I've never seen a menu. I think it would have been mostly a European cuisine rather than a Chinese cuisine.
Yeah. So Anna, where does the Melbourne refugee community gather? Are there still cafes, or where, or do they gather in your museum, or?
They do gather here. We have memorial ceremonies constantly, and also you know, there were the Landsmannschaft organizations, which, you know, went for many years, and there are different societies in Melbourne. As far as community and cafes, Ackland Street, which was mentioned earlier, sadly has you know, changed into more, you know, less survivor-run cafes to more commercial enterprises, sadly. But I'm actually quite privileged to be at an age where I could, in my younger years, go to these wonderful cafes. And in fact, we're featuring Cafe Scheherazade in our museum to commemorate Masha and Abram Seleznikov's wonderful cafe, which attracted artists and emigres, and like Karl Duldig, the artist, used to draw on napkins these portraits of the patrons, and their menu was, you know, very delicious Eastern European fare, and you know, was a real hub for survivors to meet and talk about daily business.
That sounds wonderful. So Stephen Less, who, hello Stephen, his father actually also survived or his parents survived in Shanghai, and his father was an artist. So he's asking Noit, why so-called ghetto? It was Jewish stateless persons who were forced to live in this tiny portion of Hongqiu. They needed special permission, ID, and a badge to leave. There were no walls, but people were checked when leaving or entering. Most of those in turn never got permits to leave, meaning had no work or income. The Jewish residents themselves had no knowledge of the Eastern European ghettos. The Japanese did not want to appear racist and therefore never referred to Jews in proclaiming the designated area. So, and this is where I guess it's another clarification what Noit also said on what we have been saying, that it was not the classical ghetto, it was just an area that you couldn't leave after 43. I'm just wondering, in my own research about Shanghai, I also came across how strong the Nazi Party was in Shanghai, and tried to really influence the Chinese government to turn against the Jews, which they refused. And I'm wondering whether, Noit, whether you came across that, whether, because it must have, impacted people who lived there, because I'm sure they were very sensitive to their stateless status. And I'm not sure how safe they felt in Shanghai.
That's a very long answer in terms of mapping out the different also periods, right? The different periods, the different intensification of, let's say Nazism, but the story goes, and this is something that I would have to delve into a little bit more, is that the Japanese actually, in a way, were better caretakers of the Jewish population, despite than the Nazis, even though they were obviously part of the Axis powers. So the kind of benevolence, in quotation marks, of the Japanese is better known. Horst Eisfelder does mention in his book different kind of instances of anti-Jewish or kind of personal feeling of racism, of kind of being targeted at certain moments during his youth groups and things like this. He also, there was a wonderful video, actually lecture that he did in Melbourne in 2015, in which which is available online for anybody who's interested, that also describes also his experience already in Germany. And the anti-Semitism that was present there. So I'm giving, in a way, a very general answer, because a longer answer would require very clear periodization of when, where, and how. But this is a partial answer.
Thank you so much. Thank you. This is, I guess, a question for Rodney. Did the family maintain any contact with the Chinese who worked for them in Shanghai?
After they left, I don't think so.
Mm-hmm. And did they choose to go to Australia, or how did that? They just wanted to leave Shanghai and were looking at different options, or how did that?
Well, there was a second cousin of my father had managed to get to Australia before the war, and he secured for them the necessary entry permits.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why they came to Australia. I don't know whether they made attempts to go to America, but in event, they ended up here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Rodney, did your father continue to photograph his environment when he and his family moved to Australia?
I think the short answer is yes. There are many albums that we still have to try and figure out what to do with, because they take a lot of space and we don't have the room for them all. And then there are boxes of negatives and slides, and it's going to be a challenge.
Yeah. Do you see a marked difference between how and what he photographed between Shanghai and Australia?
Yes, but it's complicated. Well, when he first arrived in Australia, one of the first things he did was go bushwalking. And so there are many photographs of the Australian bush and his fellow bushwalkers. And that's obviously something he couldn't do in Shanghai. I think until he went to Nanjing, I think he'd been able to leave Shanghai maybe once or twice into the surrounding countryside. And so, it was perhaps more focused on the bush than on the city.
Interesting. And we have a family member and of yours, Peter Fields, formerly Eisfelder, writes that his father, Ferdinand Eisfelder, was the first cousin of Horst, being older in his 20s and having knowledge of English. He was the maître of Café Louis. He also had a permit that allowed him to leave the ghetto to buy sugar and other items for the cafe. So
I don't think Ferdy worked for the cafe for long, because he had a bit of a falling out with my grandfather. Apparently my grandfather was not always an easy person to get on with. It's also why my father never worked for the cafe.
Okay, there we go. But the wife stuck to him, right? To your grandfather.
Oh yeah, my grandparents, and my uncle also. But my uncle was working in the bakehouse, so not in the cafe.
Yeah, okay. So I would like, as a last question, to Rodney also, and then I would like to invite Noit and Anna to just say something in addition that you might want to say that you feel is missing to this discussion. But Rodney, did the stay in Shanghai have an effect on your family's sense of identity? Like how? Yeah. So.
I don't know how to answer that. I really don't. I was still a teenager when my grandparents passed away. So I don't recall having any discussions with them about identity. I think they still identified as having come from Germany and from Berlin, but the time in Shanghai was certainly very important to them. And I'm sure that they were grateful that they spent the war in Shanghai rather than in Berlin.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Noit and Anna, do you want to add something to this discussion? Something that you feel hasn't been said?
Anna, please go ahead.
I find it really interesting how some people, how the variations of experiences allowed some people to really fulfill what looks like a natural move into a profession or a calling or a vocation. And but in some ways, this experience in a sort of a temporary space, despite all the hardships and the restrictions, it's just incredible how, Rodney, how your father was able to, and it didn't happen immediately because it started as an interest, and then he was able to, work with a Polish photographer and then work on his own. But every step led to what was a very fulfilling, career and experience, and just that sense of positivity is quite extraordinary. How, but also that sense of understanding what Horst was in the middle of, and how that interest allowed him to explore and capture that is such a fascinating process.
Yeah. Noit?
I would just like to add that Horst Eisfelder's images have been used for many, many decades to represent this experience without him getting credit for it. And I think that's partially also, the condition of many stateless and basically unrecognized photographers whose work just became part of a common culture, often used by other institutions to represent a certain moment without them getting credit. And I think it's really important, obviously, to insert this into the history of art, and to insert this into a specific genealogy of refugee representation, minority representation, the history of photography, and not just allow it in a way to become some kind of peripheral subject in the history of art. So I thank you also for giving us this format and giving us this platform to both make it personal, collective, and art historical. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was a very fruitful international collaboration. A big thank you goes to the speakers who shared their knowledge with us, and a very diverse knowledge. Thank you for that. Having learned, and I agreed to Noit, having learned so much about Horst Eisfelder and his Shanghai photographs, hopefully enables the audience and us to recognize his work, and inspires us to acknowledge him and his artistic achievements. Thank you so much for being with us today. Take good care and stay well. Thank you. Goodbye.